Hello and welcome to the CN Summit panel on regeneration projects. This feels like a critical moment for regeneration projects around the UK. The coronavirus pandemic has reshaped both the financial priorities of the country and the understanding of how towns and cities of the future might look and work. Flexibility in long-term development has never been more important, as well as a diversity of stakeholders. The effective bankruptcy of Croydon Council a couple of weeks back has been linked to the authority's ambitious regeneration plans, which raises questions about hundreds of council-backed town centre redevelopments around the country. Earlier this year, Legal & General injected 150 million into the redevelopment of Sheffield city centre, describing it as an essential part of the economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. Joining me today to discuss the topic are four experts who are asked to introduce themselves now. So if we begin with Simon, you're at the top right of my screen, so you kick things off.
Hi Zach, my name's Simon Bacon. I work for British Land and I'm the Development Director for our 53-acre Canada Water development.
Hazel.
Hi Zach, my name's Hazel Rounding, Shedcare Architects. We take forward sort of architecture in terms of innovation and placemaking as well. So I tend to lead our portfolio across the country.
Thanks. And Anthony.
Hi everyone, my name's Anthony Breach. I'm a senior analyst at Centre for Cities. We're a research organisation that looks at the performance of Britain's urban economies and come up with ideas on how to improve them. And I lead in our housing and planning work at the research team in Centre for Cities.
Thanks. Okay, we get stuck right into it. Simon, you've got huge development out at Canada Water. What are you anticipating the COVID impact to be, and what has changed for you?
That's quite an interesting question. I think it's quite hard to anticipate it with any real accuracy. I think there's lots of discussion around how what the future of office is going to be like. There's certainly lots of discussion internally with our own business about how we are going to work with officers. British Land as an organisation, that is our business. We're pretty heavily exposed to officers because we think they're a great asset class. So as far as Canada Water, at the moment, as regarding development, I don't think it makes a huge difference to the day-to-day. What I will say is that, like, thinking about COVID and then thinking more about, well, what could happen in the future, not necessarily with COVID, but something else along those lines. How do we prepare our portfolio and our developments going forward to work so people feel comfortable that the office environment will be okay? What we haven't really done yet, and my own personal view is that I don't think it's the right thing to do, is to start redesigning, to say, well, COVID means everybody will be working like this, and therefore we will change the way we're designing things. And personally, I think that's the right course of action. I think it's easy to get into a kind of knee-jerk reaction and do things which feel sensible, but as I'm sure everyone on the call knows and everyone listening, construction and development it takes a long time. So we don't really know where we're going to be in 6, 12, 18 months time. So I think that's wrong for officers. I had similar discussions around residential as well. But we are again looking at what we do anyway and seeing how we can put people at ease. So if you take residential layouts, for example, there was a discussion only the other week, which was, should we show how, if you were working from home, you might put a desk in here, so people feel comfortable if they're buying a 1 or 2 or 3 bed apartment, that it would work in that scenario. So I guess in short, nothing's changing as such. We're just looking at what we're doing and saying, how do we evolve with what is happening in the outside?
That's interesting. Hazel, obviously you spend a lot of time with architects. You understand design. What's the kind of response? Everything's changed, but does that mean that things will change in the future? What's been the kind of response from the designers?
I think an early stage design point of view, we should always be thinking about the next era anyway. So it's not a new thing to necessarily say, as Simon's quite rightly said, to bring out a knee-jerk reaction to a situation. I mean, in terms of workplace, for some time now, we've been talking about, is it about people sole working, sat at a computer screen? You know, I think it's evolved that conversation into, can people work from home more, but is the office then more of a place to come together in terms of collaboration than it was historically, when it was just about racking and stacking desks? I think from a placemaking point of view, it has brought up more of a conversation about the ground floor and the groundscape of a scheme. Is it all about retail and F&B offers, or should it be more, you know, what is support to the floors above, be it workspace or be it residential, and what are those ground floor spaces of the future all about? So it's not a knee-jerk reaction, but I think at a front end, it's very much sort of doing what we should be doing, which is always questioning things and always trying to better the environment.
That's interesting. Anthony, from a kind of like financial perspective, there are a lot of councils, particularly in slightly more deprived areas in the UK, that, like, you know, they bet big in terms of redeveloping their town centres before all of this happened. Aren't there some immediate things that are going to need to be addressed with some of those developments?
Yeah, I think so. You know, certainly at Centre for Cities, we've long been advocates of the importance of city centres to local economic growth. So even though city centres are about 0.1% of the country's land area, they contain about 14% of all jobs. So it's really important for cities that they get their city centres right, that they have the kind of qualities and amenities that kind of high-skilled, high-paying jobs desire and need to conduct their business. And what we found is that, you know, all too many city centres across the country just don't have the characteristics. That there's been an oversupply of retail space, kind of going back many years, which has not been kind of adjusted away as vacancy rates have risen. So we've been kind of historically big advocates of cities and kind of local authorities taking on kind of a leadership or stewardship role in assembling land in their city centres or in their town centres, and, you know, making that shift away from this over reliance on retail to other uses. Now, kind of with the kind of enormous kind of financial distress that the COVID pandemic is causing in commercial property markets, it's possible or kind of plausible, I think, that some local authorities might find themselves in trouble, especially considering that we know that local authorities have experienced massive budget cuts since 2010. But in some ways, I'm slightly more concerned about those local authorities which have borrowed to acquire commercial property outside of their boundaries in order to generate revenue to pay for services. Because while there is that kind of public good role as a steward of the local economy and kind of assembling land and developing it to provide the characteristics and qualities needed for economic growth, this more kind of speculative kind of acquisition of properties that we've seen some local authorities engage in is inherently riskier, and I think kind of less likely to get a favourable hearing from government if other places do experience kind of a Section 114 notice, as Croydon did.
Oh. And Simon, is this one of the remedies to this? Is this about having a kind of diversity of stakeholders? Is it about kind of looking at the PPP models and thinking of different ways that you can involve other partners in this?
Yes, I mean, I think, to be honest, I think that's been coming for quite some time. Is trying to figure out, you know, the best way for large regeneration, for example. Having a partnership approach is much better. Having a diversification of stakeholders, it sometimes commercially feels difficult, but absolutely gives you a much better product, better result, because you have that diversification. The different things that are pulling the development in different directions generally results in a better product in a better place. But I completely understand from the commercial view of why that can be considered to be much more difficult, because basically you don't get to say, I want it this way for these reasons. It's much harder, therefore. But as I say, I think it brings out the best in any project in any place. The same as I think is working for businesses. FTSE 100 businesses and many businesses are all striving for diversification for the same reason. It enables them to look across different areas, different borders, and say, actually, we should be doing this slightly differently to what my own perspective is like. And I think that works for when you take it into regeneration, pretty much any business transaction.
Hazel, when you get a kind of a good level of collaboration at that early stage, does that tend to filter through to the projects? And in your what are some of the experiences that you've had where that has worked well, or maybe it hasn't?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think that the best examples of regeneration are where there's collaboration at that early stage, especially the public and private bodies coming together. And we've been involved in a fair amount of SRF work. So if we're talking about town and city centres, about starting with a much wider proposal and understanding routes and use classes and everything else in those sort of mini master plans that allow for then private developers to come forward with already some strategic decisions made in terms of the land ownership. It's fair to say that probably the best examples I know are where there's been then the continued public-private approach to development. I mean, I'm a member of Placemaking Collective UK, and we visit areas of the UK on a regular basis and look at schemes. And it's not always just about a master plan, it's about an area. It's about looking at areas like Brixton, where Lambeth Council have been involved, areas of Croydon, and it's taking that messaging through. One of my best experiences is a project that we're still working on, which is Circus Street in Brighton, which has been. It was on the drawing board, I think, as a mini architectural competition about 8 years ago, and that was very much about the developer, you and I, coming in to a council-owned site, developing out the site, and that's kind of students and residential and office, a whole host of different typologies brought to the site, but in return developing a so bringing that kind of social investment back to the area as well.
You mentioned actually placemaking there. Interested, how helpful has that concept bit or the popularization of that concept been for regeneration, and will it continue to be relevant?
I think it is totally relevant. I think the word placemaking has just been overused in the wrong context. I think that those that truly understand placemaking realise that it's not about developer paying a landscape architect to fill in the spaces between the buildings, but it's a whole host of collaboration coming together, and that is from the funding and the public and private bodies. But the point of the group that I mentioned, Placemaking Collective UK, is that I nearly didn't get because I'm and the whole reasoning behind it is really to kind of advocate the fact that we're talking about economists and artists and community engagers, and it's the whole picture that comes together to create placemaking. I mean, to go back to your question, it's totally and wholly important going forward, more important than it ever has been, and the social impact that it delivers. But it's just that there's overuse of the word in the wrong context sometimes.
Okay, Anthony, what's the role of planning within this? I'm interested in, we've spoken a little bit about placemaking. The government's going to open up all these planning reforms apparently. Will that still require the same types of collaboration, or what impact do you think that will have?
Yeah, so certainly if the white paper reforms go through as the government is originally suggesting in their current form, then the changes are going to be pretty significant, and kind of the role of design, as the government puts it, beauty, is going to be much more important than it is even today. Partly because there will be a shift away in the consultation process from, rather than kind of individual comment, kind of case by case on every single planning application, which goes forward to a committee, much more of the consultation will be front-loaded into the creation of a local plan and also into the creation of local design codes, which will set the kind of aesthetics of any development which is to proceed, not just within a growth area, kind of these kind of site allocations essentially, but also within the built-up area itself. And the idea will be that if you propose something that complies with the design code, then legally and automatically you will get planning permission in order to develop. Now, kind of the actual scope of the design codes is not made clear yet, or kind of the jurisdictions by which they'll be created or how they'll be kind of overseen by an upper tier. But certainly the role of kind of place making is going to be particularly important within kind of growth areas, but then also within kind of redevelopment and regeneration of existing sites that are included within the renewal zone that the government is proposing. So getting kind of your thinking in order about how exactly a place is going to look, how exactly is it going to kind of mesh and chime with the aesthetics of a local area is, I suspect, going to become more important over the next 5 years rather than less.
What kind of impact has it had on a major regeneration project like yours, Simon?
You mean the point around placemaking, or are you, yeah? So
The planning changes. I suppose placemaking that was already a consideration as well.
Well, I couldn't agree with Hazel, to be honest. The whole kind of word placemaking. You mean, personally, throughout my career, it's been a thing. It's now has a term that's overused. I think there are lots of examples you can go through history where there's been excellent places made, designed, delivered, and some terrible ones as well, even to this day. So I think as far as the Canada Water Scheme, placemaking, in its definition, it's at the very heart of the scheme that's been put forward for outline planning. What really happens, I think, in a large regeneration scheme is you plan for flexibility. What we think is the case today, let's go back to the very first point you were making around COVID, may not be the case tomorrow. So how on earth could you plan a 53-acre, 12.5-year plus scheme in today's mind? Like, we just don't know. We don't know what retail is going to look like. We don't know how that's going to work. We don't know how people are going to use their homes, use their offices. It's just too difficult. But what you can do is you can create a framework that allows that to happen, and allows the space to be used in whichever way it needs to be used to create that place. I think as well it's really important to understand that yes, we can kind of conceptualize, visualize, and design a place. And if you think about that, I imagine everyone listening and on this now will be thinking about very different places. There's also a role to play for asset management and how that place is run. So what happens there, and that makes a big difference to whether the place is working or not. And I mean sort of the activity there. So what kind of retail shopping, is it a destination for people to go? Is it somewhere that people want to live? Are they close by? But also how well it's maintained and continually maintained so it feels like a decent place. So going back to your original point, has it formed a part of Canada Water? Absolutely. And I think it will continue to be at the forefront of everything that is done at Canada Water. And I hope, to be fair, on any major regeneration within the UK or wider, because we're all responsible for delivering parts of cities and towns which will be there for generations.
Picking up on that, you mentioned flexibility. Is that something that these planning changes should help you with, and that from what you're saying, it will be very crucial going forward?
Potentially, I think that the difficulty with planning, or I guess it's sometimes an opportunity, is the certainty point. So I think where the changes are coming around is to try and help with that certainty. The lack of certainty around planning and the way planning has evolved, I guess, from originally trying to be a set of rules, apply the rules and you get planning, to be here's a set of rules which are wide-reaching and actually you could never really achieve them all if you really, really wanted to, which makes it much more difficult for you to get certainty about will this development work or not. I think that's where the changes are trying to help and trying to address. I can see all sorts of problems that are fraught with that. The kind of tighter those the changes to planning around those design elements, the more it will be difficult for people to say yes, that applies to every scenario, and they could be used maliciously and in the wrong way. So it's a great step. It's challenging though. I can see where the issues might come.
What do you make of that, Hazel? For flexibility has to be a part of it. Are the changes music to your ears, or what do you make of them?
I think there's a lot to play out yet. As Anthony said, there's probably not quite enough detail to make a full comment. But I would agree with Simon that the flexibility is really important, and there's no doubt that a return to a more rules-based approach is probably right, because there's so much subjectivity that's brought into planning applications these days. So the principle of the rules-based approach and making those rules more deliverable, which Simon's point about how much was layered onto them before, is really key. I think it's a really good idea to start to define areas for development. So I think one of the outlines is that there's the defined growth, renewal and protected areas. So obviously that gives you the ability to seek outline planning permission, and then it is, once you start drilling into the detail, ensuring that there is a protection of design quality really, and that's the bit that I guess by having the definition of the zones in the first place and the ability to automatically get outline consent, in some ways means that there should be less debate about policy but more debate about the quality of the design and the.
Is there any danger with that process that all the successful placemaking often is to do with involving the local community, and does that bypass some of the measures that you would have to involve them?
I'm not a planning expert, but I would like to think that there is a level of community engagement in the definition of those zones in the first place, in terms of the more strategic work that is undertaken.
Okay, coming to you, Anthony, where in terms of when regeneration works and the local community is involved, or what's the kind of recipe for success with it, and is there anything that is a recipe for failure, I suppose?
So certainly the best evidence that's currently available on kind of who participates in planning consultations and why, kind of what are their characteristics, is the neighborhood defenders literature from the United States, which is used data from thousands of meetings and joined that with hundreds of thousands of comments to look at the characteristics of the people who actually do comment. And what they find is that having kind of case-by-case meetings and discussions and comments systemically privileges and the voices and views of people who oppose development, and in particular kind of older, richer male homeowners, and particularly the people who are most advantaged by blocking development, and the voices of people who would benefit from development, particularly young people, particularly renters and ethnic minorities, are systemically underrepresented in this kind of case-by-case method. So I think if we're thinking about outcomes, if we're thinking about, well, how do we make housing more affordable for people? How do we kind of have as democratic and as inclusive a process as possible? Doing it kind of one by one is really not the right way to do it. That I think the spirit of the government's recommendations, or kind of direction they're moving towards having kind of a big debate about all the different trade-offs and all the different choices that need to be made when planning for a local authority or for a local economy or an area, and having that discussion where you try and include as many people as possible, and then once you've agreed the code and you've agreed the decisions, that's kind of it, then development can proceed. I would argue that that's not just going to lead to better outcomes, but it will be more democratic because it will include more people, and because it will include a much kind of varied range of opinions and perspectives than the current process.
So how exactly do you reach the people through that? Is it having different meetings in different ways? How do you get to them?
It's a mix. I think certainly kind of the way in which we do it, in which we stick notices on lampposts and expect people to turn up, is not a particularly efficient or inclusive way of doing it. I've seen kind of Robert Jenrick has said that only about 4% of the population engage in the planning process at all, which means that 96% of the population is not engaging at all. Now, many of that 96% aren't going to engage because they don't want to. They would rather do something else with their Thursday evenings than go to a meeting to talk about housing development on the other side of town. But certainly, kind of, I think in the long term, I think if the council can kind of set out in the creation of their local plan a period in which, right, this 8-week, 12-week period, this is when we're going to have a big kind of local discussion about this, and basically blitzes the neighborhood with kind of media and communications about the process which is going on. I think it's much more likely to get involvement and engagement, especially with what they're proposing around digitizing plans and shifting away from the current process towards a more map-based process, than the current approach of this kind of trickle of case-by-case planning applications on lampposts. That would be my kind of argument and suggestion.
Simon, what have you been doing at Canada Water, and what would you like to be doing?
Around the kind of engagement and consultation point, is that? Yeah. So do you know
Yeah.
what?
So
Sorry, I was just going to say it's a really fascinating topic. Partly because around that everyone should have a say, and that there is a voice. At the same time, Anthony's absolutely right. That my own personal experience, not just at Canada Water, across other developments, is that you get a soapbox for one or two key individuals that really want to, for whatever reason, whether they've got the time, the inclination, or they see themselves as a champion, they will vocalise their point of view, and they claim to represent a large proportion of the population. So it's really tough, and actually I know British Land at Canada Water have spent a significant amount of time trying to reach everybody, and it's really hard to get those people that are, they don't oppose it. You just want to get their views. Actually, often they're quite pro, but they've got busy lives. They're going to work. They've got kids. They don't have the time, and they've got other stuff to do. And because they're okay with it, they tend to just get on with stuff. So it is really hard to get this balanced view. And then when somebody comes around and says, "Oh, so what consultation have you done? What does it look like?" All you really present is relatively negative news. So we have tried. We've been out. Before our planning permission was granted, we held thousands of different types of engagement, touched tons and tons of different people, got all of their feedback together. And we're still going through it now when we're looking at developments to say, well, what did people say about this bit of park, or what were the views? I guess to kind of round it all up there, I guess something that I think is really important is that you don't design by committee. So you can take people's views and you can go, yes, this is really interesting, but at some point somebody has to make a decision. I tend to feel those kind of design by committee approaches sort of don't work as successfully as someone making a decision saying, this is broadly what we're going to do. Yes, some of the people won't be as happy as they could be, but we think in the round it will be a better decision. And I kind of think that's where Anthony was going with what he was saying.
Is it a case that there's like a silent majority, and that we need to find ways to reach them, or to somehow get them to speak up?
Possibly. I mean, I guess the data that Anthony was talking about sort of says exactly that, doesn't it? So there's a large portion of people there which are just not engaging. I don't know. I mean, if they're not engaging, forcing them to is probably not great either, because they're not going to be particularly happy about that either. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I think the answer could be that maybe it's okay. We change the way we're going to do it, maybe going online, making things more electronic, making it easier. But the data suggests to me, from what Anthony was just saying, that trying to get everyone is going to be really, really difficult, because there's just such a lot of people there which are frankly just going on with their day to day and letting it happen around them. again, going back to my own experience, I feel like as well, we are all well educated in our areas of expertise within construction, property development. It's surprising you don't realise how much you do know about it because you spend your career looking at it. When you talk to the general public, unless for one way or another they touch our industry, you've got to remember that they think about it completely differently. They don't understand the development process, and it's really difficult to find. You've got to spend a lot of time thinking about how you explain what's happening, the time that it's going to take, the fact that the money looks like a substantial amount of money, but the returns need to be there to attract that investment, and therefore that will create a certain pull one way or the other. Trying to explain that to people is really difficult. It's really challenging, combined with the fact that not everybody wants to listen. It's not an easy task.
I'm wondering, Hazel, what do you think that will be like, or how will things change? I mean, one of the questions we've got here is like how things will look like in 2030, with all the considerations that everyone is going to have with the kind of fallout from the virus and everything. Will that require a rethink in the way that we speak about regeneration projects and that they're communicated?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, picking up on some of the discussion about how we get more people to feed into those, I think, that's got to always find different means and mediums. And Simon's right, the sort of days of saying you're going to have a 6 o'clock presentation in a town hall, are gone, because people just couldn't attend, and only those that are comfortable speaking in front of a huge amount of people would attend those events. So I think the fact that generally we're going to a more virtual existence might even help some of that, because obviously through the pandemic we've had to do all sorts of consultations online and more one-to-ones in that respect as well, which is good. And I'd say some of our more successful projects when a consultation are having a team out on the streets, having individual chats. In terms of how things change going forward, I can only speak from my point of view, and as a designer, our role has to be mediator through all sorts of different demands, and the demand for redevelopment balanced with a community perspective, balanced with an economic perspective, all feeds into how you unlock potential in an area. And what form that potential takes, because it's always got to be balanced by the drivers of both the existing community, by the redevelopment potential that we are trying to bring into an area via either a private or public body, and how you just grow and change a place really that's meeting demand.
Anthony, how much will this be a case of prioritizing certain things and seeing, like, having a long-term vision, but maybe shifting so that the most immediate things with the quickest gains are delivered the soonest?
Do you mean from the reforms, or more kind of?
I mean, from regeneration in generally, is it a case of like the projects where it's like you're going to get the benefits as quick as possible, or should it be the ones where they're most in need? What way should it work?
That's a tricky question. I think one of the things about the current process is that it probably needs to be done in a way which manages the political risk the most. So we saw with the Haringey development vehicle a couple of years ago that process kind of completely collapsed because the political risk kind of, even though it wasn't kind of red on blue, like a change in local authority control, which caused that project to fail. Kind of internal divisions inside the local authorities leadership spiraled out of control and then caused that project to go under. Now, I think if that project had been managed so that there'd been much clearer messaging about social rented properties in particular and social housing, then that process probably maybe could have been avoided. compared to kind of the outcome that we actually saw. Now, if the kind of planning reforms kind of change that and introduce a lot more certainty into the process, and that political risk diminishes, then I think kind of developers have more options, right? That they can instead kind of focus on delivering either the most profitable bit of the site first, or in developing the elements which provide social need, or on the most kind of attractive or kind of the center points of a development in question. But if the white paper process itself does not succeed, like if that in itself fails, then I think that political risk is going to continue for really major regeneration projects anyway.
Is that a problem that political risk is even an element of this? Should we not be making these decisions based on an economic basis?
Yeah. I mean, I would totally agree. Certainly, our analysis is that the UK has unusually bad housing outcomes compared internationally, because we have an unusually dysfunctional planning process. Like, our case-by-case approach to development politicizes it, makes it very uncertain, as Simon was saying, and effectively rations the supply of housing and restricts it, creating a housing shortage. And in response to that, we've been big advocates of what we call a flexible zoning system. So having a system in which the zones are agreed in advance. There's a local plan which sets out what can be built and where. And if you propose something that complies with the zoning and complies with building regs, then legally and automatically you have to be given planning permission to actually do that. Now, that's how most of the world does urban planning. It's not how we do it. But if we introduce something like that, and I think the government's white paper is a really good step in that direction, then housing outcomes will improve massively. We'll see much greater convergence to housing quality, housing affordability that we see in other developed countries around the world. So we really have to crack that planning problem. And you're exactly right that it's too politicized at present.
Simon, I wonder what element time has to do with it. Is that we've been working on very short time frames, and now we are perhaps moving to time frames that allow for kind of proper regeneration to take place?
I don't know. It's an interesting point. I think it depends on the project. It depends how they're funded. There's capital out there that needs, basically the turnaround needs to be yesterday, because that's how their business model is driven, and there's more patient capital. There's also then the business models which we touched on briefly around placemaking. Some business models basically work on a spreadsheet, and it's very difficult to put in that spreadsheet what the value of place is going to be. Everyone looks back at different developments to say, well, this development did X, and you can see did Y, and therefore there's a justification for spending a bit more money early. But not all money, all investment will accept that kind of risk or that kind of profile. So I think the question of time, it depends. There has been a general growth in property values, land values, which has helped that sort of time-based approach work in London. And I think that has benefited some people more than others. But I do believe personally that not having to go to chase the money, to chase the returns, to be as quick as possible, does allow some breathing space. The bigger the scheme, the more complicated it is, the more time you need to kind of use that iterative design process. I'm sure Hazel will explain a lot better than I could how iterative design is, and especially when it's complicated. You take a few steps forward and you might come back just because you learn a bit more or you collaborate with someone else. Only a few questions ago we were talking about the importance of having different stakeholders. Well, you need to let those stakeholders be part of that process, and you will make mistakes, and that has to be okay. So I guess the short answer is I think time is important, but I don't think it's a blanket. Different money goes different ways on different projects. I don't think there's a blanket answer to it, to be honest.
Just picking up on that, you mentioned the kind of value that doesn't fit into a spreadsheet. Should that be something that we're looking to quantify? You've seen efforts around social value, that there's metrics being developed to kind of measure things like that. Well, should there be a kind of metric to quantify the type of value you're talking about?
It would be helpful. but the very fact it's hard to put in a spreadsheet makes it quite difficult to find a metric, is my opinion. I think if you consider how you might go and pick a part of anyone's business, how you might do business with somebody, often you pick that company or those individuals on, yes, some hard facts, but also on the way they do work. So I think each developer and each person feeding into any development has like a moral obligation to be doing things in the right way, and that's how we should be then picking the people that develop different bits of cities in different areas. It's really important to do that because, as you're saying, when I try and find the metrics, I think it's really tough. I think it's really, really hard to, we do that at Canada Water. We sit there and say, we should be spending some more money in this public realm or in this area. But, well, it doesn't work with the numbers. I'm like, well, we believe it will in the future in the round. And then eventually, after looking at it enough times and getting enough people's input, we go, okay, yes, we'll make that investment. We'll put the money into something that we believe is going to work in the future. Not everyone does that. Trying to find a metric for it, yes, that would be useful. Will it solve all of the problems? Probably not. I don't think so.
So wondering, Hazel, you've worked on a lot of kind of regeneration. Is that what Simon's describing there? Is that something that you can relate to, that you've seen in terms of working with the right people? And then again, I suppose the question is there a way of helping that, or creating a set of criteria so that you're able to work with the right people on a more consistent basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the sort of iterative design process and the length of time it takes to regenerate an area, and I think we are talking about regeneration here, so that's the word, isn't it? It's regeneration. It's an existing area that is being transformed. So the idea of a sort of phased development is, in my experience, works best when we don't forget that there's an existing community in terms of involvement. There's existing businesses that might need to be retained or be given a new life somewhere else. So the wider thinking of the sort of design code SRF approach that then allows all of those economic and planning factors to play out, and for times to change and our needs change, and that it sort of instills a bit of maybe meanwhile use in, whilst keeping some of the existing businesses and residents in an area, that then over time plays out. For me, that those are the best examples and the best schemes I've worked on, and the best schemes I've seen on my travels, where it's not a white canvas approach to placemaking. It's regeneration, which starts at the heart of an area, and the grain of a place and the community in that place are taking on that journey through, and that can only really be done by consistency in a very early stage design code, and consistency in personnel involved as well, whilst allowing opportunities. That there can be a framework approaches, I suppose what I'm saying, and that can then play out as a number of different projects.
It's interesting that we've heard two different ways of looking at this. Anthony, I suppose, as someone that does look and see whether you can measure some of the things that Simon and Hazel have touched upon, is there anything that you've come across that has measured that well? And could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so we actually published a report in September this year, actually looking at the Green Book, which the Treasury is in the process of rewriting. So the new Green Book is going to be announced on Wednesday. And the context for that is primarily around the levelling up agenda and whether the Green Book is biased towards the north of England. And we find that it isn't, that if anything, it's biased against London and the southeast. But this was one of the questions which came up in that process, right? When you're making an economic appraisal, when you're putting the numbers in the spreadsheet, how much should you be trying to kind of capture those non-quantifiable benefits and costs that come with a particular business case or an investment? And the side which we kind of landed on was that you pretty much shouldn't be trying to kind of quantify things that are very difficult to quantify, that maybe you should be considering it as part of the kind of value for money case. So if you're thinking about, getting a vague idea of, what are the benefits in a kind of abstract sense of doing a particular intervention, which we can't quantify, but what's the rough estimate of those of such benefits? But that really a lot of the non-quantifiable benefits belong in the kind of strategic case for an investment. So that if you're thinking about achieving kind of high social impact or going carbon neutral or other such kind of interventions which are may or may not kind of have an impact on the margin of the development. Really, that belongs in the argument which you're making for the investment in the first place, and that should be part of your strategic objective, which you're trying to assess, rather than kind of bundling it up with kind of the profit and loss on a particular development. And by doing that, you don't just strengthen the kind of quantifiable bits of the analysis. So you make them kind of cleaner and simpler. But you also then, create the logic for strategic interventions to do to achieve those kinds of benefits. So if you can say from the outset, all right, we're going to make money on this development, but we're also going to achieve this specific social impact from the beginning. That's what we're going to set out to do. Then you can go through this entire very, very long process and make sure that you achieve that additional objective, as well as making a profitable development at the same time. But you need to sort of bundle it into the strategic element of the business case rather than into the spreadsheets, as Simon was saying.
Brilliant. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much for appearing on this panel. Thanks to everyone.